tonight's topic is Islam. What do we really know? Now, this is the second time of exploring Islam. I think we just looked at something, was it some article or something like that that I'd seen? I can't remember what it was actually in the first exploration. It was about a month ago, maybe even more. So, yeah, it's been a while. We'll go back to it. Now, I've got a video for us to watch. There's loads of videos about Islam on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, all the social medias where you can put videos on. There's loads on Islam. And there's varying opinions and what people have chosen to believe about Islam, you know, for and against it, or the people who sit on the fence saying, no, everyone's allowed to believe what they want to believe and all the rest of it. Yeah, loads of different opinions. So I'm trying to get down to what is it and where's the hard evidence of its origins, and let's take it from there. So I found this video on a channel. What are they called? It's like it's the American Academy in Berlin, something like that. And it's about an hour and a half long, so we probably won't get through it today, but I thought we'll give it a go. We'll start on it, and it looks as though it's a lecture. So I'm hoping that means that there's going to be some hard facts. Welcome everyone in the chat. Anyone who hasn't got a spanner, I'll be giving spanners as we watch this video. No need for any moderation duties. It's just you can drop links and go and subscribe to each other's channels and stuff like that. No timing out, no banning, nothing in here. Right, yeah. So tonight's exploration is Islam, and here's the video that we're going to get stuck into.
Good evening, I'm Terry McCarthy. I'm the president of the Academy. Delighted you could come and join us tonight for the Nina Maria Gorison lecture, which is made possible by Nina von Malzahn, one of our great supporters. Our speaker tonight, Fred Donner, is at the University of Chicago. And I promise not to say anything more about the vortex beyond just reminding you that in balmy Berlin, we are now 40 degrees warmer than where Fred normally works. So Fred is quite happy to be with us here for this semester, as you might imagine. He's the Peter B. Ritzma Professor of Near Eastern History at the University of Chicago. He got his PhD from Princeton, and he taught Middle Eastern history at Yale before going to the Windy City. He's written a bunch of books, including The Early Islamic Conquests, Narratives of Islamic Origins, and more recently, Muhammad and the Believers, which created quite a lot of attention, as I understand. And while he's here, he's going to be examining Berlin's Arabic papyrus collection. Berlin has a very large Arabic papyrus collection. A lot of it hasn't actually been examined, as we understand. And we actually have here, this papyrus is about 4,000 years old. So when we pass it around later, please be very, very careful. Fred will explain how that all works. And then afterwards, we'll have a little chat, and then we'll open it up to questions. But I give you Fred Donner.
Thank you, Terry, very much for your kind words. I think you misspoke, though. I think it's 4,000 minutes old. But we'll hand it around later. And before I go further, before I really start, I'd like to thank Terry and the American Academy in Berlin for allowing me to be here this semester. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. A wonderful place. You know, I met earlier today with one of the many wonderful staff members of the Academy, Jessica von Rede, about some routine paperwork that we all have to take care of with her. And at the end, characteristically, she asked, well, how are you getting settled in? Are you enjoying it here? Is everything okay for you? And I told her, well, yeah, I love it here. It's sort of like going to heaven without the inconvenience of having to die first. So it's just great here, really. So thank the Academy. I thank the Academy. I'm sure all my colleagues feel the same way who are here like me as fellows. And I thank all of you for coming tonight. And I hope you are avid and generous supporters of the Academy, because it certainly is a worthwhile organization. So my topic tonight is Islam's origins, myth, and material evidence. As most of you surely know, there has long been a standard or traditional view of how Islam began. In reference to this standard view, the great French historian Ernest Renan said in the 19th century that Islam was, quote, born in the full light of history, end quote. It's not really a quote because it would have been in French, but it's close. But since that time, it has become ever clearer that what I call the traditional Islamic origins narrative, which almost everyone accepted with considerable confidence, is far less secure than we once thought. First, however, I think I need to sketch very quickly the outlines of this traditional view of how Islam began for those of you who are not familiar with it. And I know there are many people in the audience, many of you are my colleagues from the Freie Universität or elsewhere and are very familiar with it. So set your snooze alarm for about 8 or 9 minutes. I'll get through this. So at the center of this traditional narrative is the person of Muhammad, who is recognized by Muslim tradition as the prophet who brought God's revelation to his followers. The traditional death date for Muhammad is given as 632 Common Era, so first third of the 7th century. So he was seen, or is seen, as the founder of a new religion, which we call Islam. And he was born and raised at first in the city of Mecca. Here's a photograph of Mecca, not from the time of the Prophet, I'm sorry to say, but around 1900 maybe, or late 19th, early 20th century. Now, the town of Mecca, small even in the late 19th century, of course, very small in the 7th century, maybe a few thousand people. But nonetheless, it was a town that had a pagan or polytheistic population, that is, people worship many different gods. And it had an important shrine as in the center of the town, which you can see here, the famous Kaaba, or basically it means a cube in Arabic, a black stone construction. It was a courtyard around it, but that's the Kaaba there. And this was the center of various pagan rites, which the Quraysh tribe, the tribe of Mecca, supervised and profited from by taking care of all the pilgrims who came to the town. So Mecca had this important cultic life, or so we are told, and it was also a town that was supported by commercial life because it was a center of a caravan trade in which the Meccan merchants organized caravans that went south to the Yemen and north to Syria and northeast to Iraq and so on, carrying various goods, some of them reputedly luxury goods, great distances, and this was part of the economic basis of the city. What am I doing here? Wrong button. Okay, here's another picture, I think a little bit more recent, but closer up so you get to see the Kaaba shrine in the middle and various other buildings around it. Well, at about age 40, Muhammad was raised in this town in the pagan environment, but he was and he seems to have been a promising young man, but at about age 40, he was on a kind of retreat. He used to go off to get away from it all and sit quietly in the outskirts of the city and reflect on life or whatever. And at one point, he began to receive what he took to be revelations from God. That is, he felt like he was overcome with this sense of a presence, and he was seeing and especially hearing things and kind of in a trance-like state, we are told. And when he came out of it, he had a passage of text that was kind of burned into his memory, and he could recite it. And so he proceeded to go back at first with great trepidation and tell his family and friends about these experiences. Some of them then became followers in his new religious ideas that were part of this. So this is, in Muslim tradition, this is the revelation of God's word to the prophet. This is, and he had these episodes periodically during his life when he would get a new download of more material. And this material then was memorized by him, but it was also memorized by his followers. He would recite it to them and they would gradually learn it. Some of them wrote it down in pieces of stuff that was written. And after he died, then all these recitations were collected by a kind of editorial committee, and all the written pieces were gathered together, and they produced a sort of complete single text, which is the text of the Quran, the sacred scripture of Muslims. So for Muslims, the Quran is literally God's word as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. And in case you didn't realize it, of course, the Quran is in Arabic, so God speaks Arabic. So, you know, if you have any sense and want to be well cared for in the afterlife, you should definitely take Arabic. Well, what were the fundamental ideas he was preaching? We can deduce most of these from the Quran text itself. The central one, of course, is the idea of monotheism, a very strict understanding of monotheism, that there is only one God, the creator God, who creates the world, creates us, creates everything in the universe. And that because this God is all powerful and all creating, we owe him our gratitude in forms of prayer and so on. Obviously, the tradition, the package of religious ideas also includes the notion of prophecy. Since Muhammad was a prophet, the idea that God singles out specific individuals to receive his guidance for mankind. And it includes the idea of a revealed book, which contains some kind of guidance or law for the community of believers. Also quite prevalent in certain parts of the Quran is warnings about the impending last judgment. That is the idea that the end of time is going to come maybe sometime soon, and that we better be ready for it. And that what will happen at the end of time is that we will all be hauled before the divine judge, including all the dead who will be raised from the dead. All the souls will be awakened. Everyone will come forth before God, and we will all be judged individually, depending on how we behaved in this life that we have or had. And then will we be either rewarded by being sent to heaven or punished by being sent to hell. And this, of course, then means that there's a strong emphasis also on piety or God-fearingness, the idea that if you're going to be saved in this life, you really need to behave yourself, right? You shouldn't do things that God finds hateful in social discourse and so on. So there's a strong emphasis on pious behavior, as well as this more abstract notion of a single God who creates everything. Well, the preaching of these ideas by Muhammad, he did win some followers, quite a few, it seems, but it also generated quite a bit of opposition in the town of Mecca, in his hometown, from some of his kinsmen. The simplest way to put it is because, well, maybe they felt their economic ties were somehow threatened, but mainly I think they were appalled at the idea that some of their ancestors, since this was a culture that engaged, it was a tribally organized culture, and they all identified themselves as descendants of some ancestor whom they revered. The idea that these ancestors were pagans and therefore were going to be going to hell was not welcome news to them. So they didn't really like this set of preachings. And so there was increasing opposition to Muhammad and his followers who were trying to do their prayers and other devotions from time to time, and they would be ridiculed or abused in various ways by their townsmen. So finally, it was necessary for them to go somewhere else. Fortunately, just as things were coming to a head, a crisis point, a delegation of people came from the town of Yathrib, which is about 350 kilometers north of Mecca in Western Arabia, and invited Muhammad and his followers to come to Yathrib to be arbiters of their own city's kind of internal squabbles among different tribal groups. And so Muhammad and his followers in the year 622 make their emigration from Mecca to Yathrib, which comes to be known later as Medina, the city of the Prophet. This event is known as the Hijra, the emigration. And it's an important moment because it marks the beginning of the first autonomous, sort of self-governing Muslim community in Mecca. The Muslims were not able to be self-governing. There were lots of non-believers around who really controlled things. But in Yathrib or Medina, they were able to sort of organize themselves as a community as they wished to. And it's also important, this Hijra in 622, because it's the starting date for the Muslim calendar. It came to be taken later as the starting point of the Muslim calendar. So when you see Muslim dates, they go back to this event in 622. Although, because the Muslim year is only 356 days long, and instead of 300, it's a lunar year, it means that you can't just subtract 622 from a common era date and get the right Islamic date. You have to go to a table or a conversion schedule somehow. So Muhammad was then living in Yathrib with his followers. There was tension between him and his followers on the one hand, and some of the people in Yathrib who joined him and became very close to him, and others in Yathrib who, again, felt a certain distance or took a somewhat more skeptical attitude towards his activities. And so he had a long period of 7 or 8 years where he was trying to, and successfully did overcome the opposition of these various groups. Among them, the most famous or infamous episodes have to do with several large Jewish clans in the city of Yathrib. It had clans of people who were Jews, but also people who were not Jews. They were presumably pagans of some kind. They all converted to Islam, apparently, and accepted the idea of monotheism. The Jews, of course, were already monotheists. They didn't have to change at all. But there developed, it seems, according to the traditional narrative, intense or tensions between Muhammad and his followers on the one hand and some of these Jewish clans, which resulted in some rather ugly episodes in which the Jews were driven out of the community, or in one case, the Jewish clan was basically all the men were executed and the women and children taken in as slaves. If these stories are true, and that's a question about this whole later narration of what happened, but come to that another time. In any case, as he was consolidating his position in Yathrib or Medina, he and his followers were also beginning to proselytize outside of the city of Yathrib and win following from among different tribal groups and small villages, mostly pastoral nomadic tribal groups in the vicinity. Ultimately, it was possible to confront the city of Mecca where he had come from. The Meccans had attacked Yathrib a couple of times, actually. And finally, after several years, the Prophet was able to go back and take over Mecca in a more or less peaceable way. He just came in and occupied it, and the Meccans agreed that they would accept his new faith and admit him to the city. And so he and his followers came in and they did pilgrimage at the site of the Kaaba, and they were now part of this growing state in Western Arabia with Medina at its center. The Prophet stayed in Medina. He went back to Medina. He didn't stay in his hometown. And so this begins a process of expansion of the Islamic State that was astonishingly rapid, starting after his death in 632. After his death, instead of the state falling apart, his followers organized themselves and began to press out to take ever larger areas, a process usually called something like the Islamic conquest or the Arab conquest. I don't like either term very much, but that's the term that's usually used for it. And in the process of this, we can see from the map, there's a very rapid expansion. This dark green is the area that was controlled more or less by the time of the Prophet's death. Within a couple of years, the rest of the Arabian Peninsula had been taken over by armies organized by his first successor, a man named Abu Bakr. And then shortly thereafter, within a few more years, a decade or two, this whole area, including Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, and much of Iran, was taken over. And they kept pushing to the horizons so that by, say, 740, they controlled all the way from Spain, all the way to the Indus River Valley here. So it was a very rapid expansion. The first 30 or 40 years, sort of inexplicably rapid, and historians, including myself, have puzzled over this for a very long time to understand how this could be, especially because the expansion started in a place, namely Medina and Western Arabia, that first of all had no tradition of statecraft, and second of all had no obvious resources to support an expansion. So how was this possible? And in the process, they overthrew one of the two great powers of the day, the Sasanian Empire, which had been situated on the Iranian plateau and in Iraq, in this area. They completely overthrew that, and they took away about half of the later Roman or Byzantine Empire, which was centered in Constantinople, but had controlled Syria and Egypt and large areas around the Mediterranean. They managed to take these territories away from these two empires somehow, without obvious means of doing so. Here's another map showing the expansion and showing, in a rather speculative way, I think I can say, the possible routes of some of the armies in this multifaceted process of expansion. Okay, so that's basically the outline of the traditional origins narrative. I already mentioned some of the problems that seem to inhere in it, but not all of them by any means. And the problems are numerous.
I just want to say I'm glad that after saying all of that, he said that it's a narrative, okay? Because I was starting to think, is this guy actually speaking as though any of this stuff is true? So, yeah, we'll just continue. I just thought I'd stop to say yes. He finally said narrative.
And they're very deep, actually. First of all, this picture is based on, it's a voluminous picture. We have tons of detail about all aspects of it, pretty much. But it's based on sources that are much later. The sources are mostly literary sources, chronicles, biographical dictionaries, and the like, that come from the later Muslim community, and most of them were not written until 2 or 3 centuries after the events that they're supposed to be describing, the life of the Prophet. They're not from the 7th century. They are from the later 8th century or the 9th century, the 10th century, and even later in some cases. Yes, some of these later sources rely on earlier reports that were apparently transmitted orally, or maybe they were written down in notebooks that have been lost, and so the reports are subsumed into these later compilations. But there's very little, we have to be very skeptical about the idea that any of these things really goes back to original documents from the time of the Prophet or of the early conquests. So there's that sort of problem in principle with the evidence that it is later. Another problem is that when we look at the different Muslim narratives about what happened in the origins period, we find a lot of contradictions in the sources between one report and another report. And well, how do you sort out these contradictions? For a century or more, lots of people tried to sort of attack these accounts and harmonize them, work out a way to sort of see if they could all be seen as valid, but it was kind of a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of some small thing. But more and more that seemed to be not possible. There just seemed to be sort of irreconcilable differences between some of those sources. Another problem was that the narration, however you took it, from these Muslim sources of later date seemed to conflict with the narrations that we have from non-Muslim sources, mainly Christian sources, that were written somewhat earlier, that were written in the later 7th century and the early 8th century, so before the Muslim sources were written down. We have from the Christian community some descriptions of these new people coming and what was happening. And while in some ways they track with the Muslim sources, not too badly, in other ways, they seem to be quite at variance with what the Muslim sources say. And finally, this traditional narrative is based on almost no actual documentation. That is, no texts or documents or real artifacts that came from the time itself and from the people themselves who were making this history. Historians like to work with documents. That's the most secure basis for us to reconstruct the past. But there were very few documents actually available from this period, as it turns out. And the ones that were available basically weren't used. And I think they weren't used by Western scholars for a long time, mainly because Western scholars already had a nice prepackaged story, the traditional origins narrative story coming out of these narrative sources. And so you're working with the actual documents, which are miserable scraps of papyrus and coins and so on. So all these little bits of information, it's very hard to get a general picture. It's very hard to put it together. It's much easier to just read these narrations of what actually happened, right? And so I think that was one of the reasons why, at least for 100 years or so, people really didn't pay that much attention to the documentary evidence. Well, now that people seem to be more aware, since about the 1970s, scholars are more aware that we can't just go on using the traditional origins narrative as the basis for our own understanding. We have to come to a somehow more scientific, historically scientific view of what was going on. There's been a kind of paradigm shift, I think, but Western scholars attempted to figure out ways that we could get a better picture. One, of course, was to look at the traditional sources like these and to try to make minor modifications to harmonize things. But as I said, that wasn't really a process that worked very well. Here's a few of the things that have come out in recent years. I could put my own book in there, but my own recent one, but I didn't. On the other hand, there were some scholars who said, this traditional picture is so completely wrong that we need to just throw it out completely and start over using only documents and a few things. And in fact, this I think is going too far. One scholar, John Wansbrough, he was an American, but he taught at the University of London for most of his life, even opined that, we'll never be able to know what actually happened at the beginnings of Islam, and historians should just stop trying. And well, for me as a historian, this is not a very satisfying way to look at things. I think we need to do more. This approach is a little bit too radical. The fact is that there are some documents that confirm bits of information we find in the traditional narrative sources. And so we can't just throw out the traditional narratives entirely, even though we have to be very circumspect in using them. And this rather complicated looking chart, I hope is not too complicated, so you have a timeline at the bottom of dates. And so Muhammad dies somewhere here around 632. The Umayyad dynasty comes to rule in 660 and rules to 750, and the Abbasid dynasty overthrows them in 750 and rules until 1258, actually. And the Quran, as far as we can tell, crystallizes. Muslim tradition would say it crystallizes already by hearsay, but I think recent work in Quran manuscripts suggests that maybe it's still undergoing some evolution up until about 700. We don't really know yet. This is work that's going on as we speak still today. Then you have documentary sources produced first by the people in this believers movement itself. So I put D's here to give an idea. So we have a few in the 7th century and then more and more and more. Now this might be a coin or...
Hang on a minute before he goes any further. This X begins after the center, the middle of the 700s. Now, that's 600 CC, MUH, and then in brackets it's got the crucifix in 632. That's because MUH is for Muhammad, right? He died, that's what the crucifix is for, in the year 632. As if he existed, right? If it was true. I'm not convinced. Now, the first X began beyond the mid 700s, so well over 100 years after Muhammad's death. That's the first trace of the so-called Quran, which, I mean, as far as I know, doesn't exist because it got destroyed all those years ago. So all they've got now is what the big nose of London would call ravayat, which is the Arabic word, when translated into English, means narration. And narration is just hearsay. It's just someone else saying that this happened. It's a narrative. That's what a narration is. Narrat, narrat, right? Narrative or narration, narration, right? They're two words of the same family. So, I mean, a narration, hearsay, right? That's Chinese whispers, rubbish. So it's not actually the Quran. Anyway, yeah, I just wanted to stop there and point it out that first X is well over 100 years after Muhammad died, if he existed, if any of this stuff is true anyway.
A scrap of papyrus. It may not tell us a whole lot, but it tells us something. The Christian sources, often literary sources that are a little bit more expansive, some of those are earlier. So we can get information from them and try to piece this together. And so the challenge now is to try to piece all this together and fit it into the beginnings of the narrative sources, which, as you see, really start up about here and become voluminous at this point. And they project back what they thought had happened to this much earlier period. So we have to somehow work with these different categories of material and to try to assemble a more, shall we say, plausible narrative. So I think that it makes sense then to start with the earliest information dating from the 7th century that we can find, the true narrative information, or whatever kinds of material we have from the 7th century, and then maybe tap that into the traditional origins narrative as we feel we can connect it. And this information from the 7th century then comes especially from two sources, information from within the community itself. One is the Quran text, and the other is documentary evidence like, say, coins or papyri.